Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come all you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way. So Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered...
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the latest live stream on this, the 6th of November 2023. It's another day when we're going to be focusing on, not just on the events in Palestine, but zooming out for a more theoretical discussion, but with very severe practical implications. And this arises due to the positions taken by a number of people in the Western left regarding both the Palestinian issue, but also the war in Ukraine, and how many of these individuals have gotten the entire question completely wrong. Now, one might say, echoing the words of Jean-Paul Sartre in his introduction to Wretched of the Earth, well, why the hell are you bothering with a bunch of irrelevant numpties, to use a very British term, in academic Marxism and on the Trotskyite left in Britain and America and in Europe? And to that I'll reply in a couple of ways. Firstly, it is unfortunately the case that in Britain and the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and as to the best of my knowledge, France and certainly Germany, all of these places still within both the Labour movement and the what is referred to as the wider left, the kind of ideas and approaches that we're going to be talking about this evening still have a degree of resonance. In fact, they have a good degree of influence. And for that reason, it is necessary to discuss them and critique them. And it is particularly necessary at this time, given that if the movement against the US war on the Palestinians, and we should always emphasize that it is a US war, they are the ones supplying the money, they are the ones supplying the weaponry. It is as much a US and US imperialist bloc war as the war in Ukraine is. The Israelis are the chosen tools in this particular battle, just as the Ukrainians were the less successful tools in Ukraine. They are both, however, tools of US imperialism. And if we are to make a success of the growing movement that is based on the very correct popular revulsion against the actions of US imperialism in Israel and occupied Palestine, then we must start to properly outline the problems with the current leadership in that movement and the trends that tend to have influence within it. And so for those reasons, it is necessary to discuss the ideas of people who I wouldn't usually waste a handkerchief on to wipe away after you'd blown your nose, basically. But unfortunately, they still retain a degree of influence. I'm talking, of course, of the British organised Trotskyism, or though to call it organised would be to give it too much credit, but unfortunately it still retains an influence. And beyond that, certain kinds of academic Marxism that still persist. But I'm going to say that all of it has certain things in common, which Lenin dealt with very effectively over 100 years ago, but unfortunately retain their influence because I would argue they have proven to be of use to imperialism in misleading and mystifying and obfuscating what should be clear questions. And that's the role of academic Marxism in Britain, the US, and elsewhere. But before we get started, let's take a look through the various different places we're streaming and say hello to various people who are in the chat. So James Graham, who says Z, PMs, who says glory to the resistance, quite right. DE, good evening. Putin's shirt, hello to you. Mike Martinez says greetings and solidarity. Putin's shirt says, I just came from Richard Medhurst's live stream where I watched 2 hours of videos of the Gaza genocide. God, I'm so depressed. Well, I could do that, but I don't think that I don't think that adds anything, to be honest. I mean, I know why Medhurst is showing it, because you don't get a lot of that on typical news channels. So I understand why people show it. I would question, though, why you would spend 2 hours showing it. Because there is a tendency, and I will come more to this later, amongst many people who they view these abominable acts by US imperialism, and they rightly get angry, and they want something to be done about it. And that is the perfectly natural response of any humane and decent person. The problem is that because we don't live in a time where the correct approach is taken in many respects, what you get when you basically spend all day watching that kind of thing is you get a lot of people who they get angry, they get mobilized, and because they don't find better answers, the anger, I've seen this happen many times. We saw it 20 years ago in the Iraq War. The anger peaks and then dissipates again. And it just turns inward and becomes depression and bitterness. And that's what we're trying to avoid. And so that's why we're talking about what we're talking about tonight. So, Roddy, good evening to you. Good evening to Beiju. Good evening or good afternoon, depending upon where you are, to Martin. And good evening to Irish Partisan, our comrade in Minsk. D says, do you think there is any significant difference between Trots and other Euro-communists nowadays? Well, between Trots and Khrushchevite revisionists, which I think is what you're referring to, no. Very little. In fact, in my particular country, old perfidious Albion, the Trotskyites and the Khrushchevite revisionists always work together, 90% of the time. They pretend that they don't like each other, but they're always working together in, like, Stop the War and Palestine Solidarity. They all support the Labour Party, whether they openly admit it or not. I mean, we had a farcical situation at the weekend where you've got the Communist Party of Britain going on about Palestine solidarity and making some points that everybody would agree with. But at the same time, they are still going to tell you to vote for the Labour Party when it comes to the next election. Now, they will obfuscate and try and deny that, but that is their political strategy. That is what the British Road to Socialism says that they're doing. They're trying to assemble a coalition with the Labour Party. That's what they want to do. Now, they'll argue that they want to work with the left of the Labour Party, etc., etc. But it's still the case that in many, many elections over the last 70 years, the Communist Party and its predecessor organisation, the Communist Party of Great Britain, called for a vote for the Labour Party. So the Communist Party of Britain, the Khrushchevite revisionists here, pass a motion saying solidarity with Palestine. At the same time, they're planning to say, vote Labour, vote for Keir Starmer. The man who is essentially just he's a non-entity. He's a man who just is, his head is just filled up every morning with the talking points that come straight out of the White House and the State Department, and he mouths them like a fish out of water. And that's the state of Khrushchevite revisionism. It'll say solidarity with Palestine, then it'll try and get you to elect a man and a party that not just recently, but over the last however many years, over the last 70 years have been nothing but abysmal. I mean, in the case of the Labour Party, you're looking at 120 years of pro-imperialist support for not just Israel, but every colonial project that British and US imperialism have engaged in. So that's the state of the CPB. The state of the Trots is that, and we might as well start the actual program now, seeing as we've got into it. The state of the Trots is that they will say, Palestinians have a right to resist, and this is, of course, a position that you can't avoid taking. But then what they'll say is, but we don't like Hamas. They're terrible. We don't like. They're pro-capitalist. They're Islamic fundamentalists. We can't possibly have anything to do with them. So okay, so you, Mr. Trotskyite, support apparently the Palestinians' right to resistance, but you don't support. You want to criticize and nitpick and say and denounce sometimes the organization in the form of Hamas that's actually the main force in that armed resistance movement. You're saying basically that we support national liberation in theory, but in terms of the actual practice of it, in terms of the groups that are the strongest within occupied Palestine, well, we can't support them because they're bad. And of course, you try and talk to any of these people and about the fact that there is a coalition, there is a national coalition of revolutionary and nationalist forces in occupied Palestine, headed by Hamas, it is true, but also with several other organizations within it. And you try and talk to them about that, and they'll look at you as if you're trying to explain a particularly difficult long division problem, or that you're trying to explain how to work out pi from scratch or something. So it's something that they're just unaware of. And the problem relates to a serious error when it comes to thinking about both revolutionary tactics and the national question. And it's a mistake the Trotskyists always make. I'm pausing now because Irish Partisan has some urgent news. In the chat, breaking news. Assistant to Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Zelensky, Yuri Kristyakov, died as a result of a grenade explosion at his home. Ukrainian police claim that Kristyakov died as a result of a careless handling of a grenade. However, local media and Zelensky himself claim that the grenade was hidden in one of the gifts. Well, we might as well just stray into this for a moment, given that it's breaking news. I can't say I'm surprised, because there's been a lot of talk coming out of the Ukraine, and particularly the Maidan regime's hierarchy around Zelensky, that the getting rid of Zelensky is imminent for various reasons. Zelensky apparently feels rather insecure, and he's looking to rid himself of a potential competitor. That they would assassinate his assistant, which seems to be what has happened here, seems to be like a classic case of a regime that's on the skids. Once the hierarchy start killing each other, and it will be some faction or another within Ukraine that's done this, they'll try and blame it on the Russians, but the Russians have no reason to kill this guy. They're winning the war. Why would they need to engage in acts of assassination when they presumably know very well where the Ukrainian armed forces commanders are? They could easily kill him in more effective ways. So this is a Ukrainian internal row that has got to the point of one group trying to off supporters of another. And if this is the case that Zelensky is now finding his entourage openly attacked, well, we can expect, I would say we can expect some kind of response. Is Zelensky, I don't know, is he going to go on the run? Is he going to surrender to the Russians? Who knows where this is going to go? Because this is largely, it seems, a result of Zelensky being seen as the number one contender against Zelensky. So Zelensky and his entourage have got to be in the mix as a potential suspect. And the reason they are all turning on each other now is because they know the end's coming. They're losing badly, or have lost badly, in Avdiivka. The Russian forces are strengthening all over the front line. The Russians still have around 300,000 men in reserve that they apparently haven't deployed yet. They single thing that they've done, other than a few stray missile strikes, the Ukrainians that is, has not worked. The funding that Biden asked for is held up as Biden has an almighty row, or more to the point, the Biden administration has a row with Congress. It's all going very, very wrong, and it's not going to get better anytime soon. They are facing the end. And as Martin's comment draws our attention to, Zelensky could get couped. It's possible. I doubt that the US imperialists would want that. They appeared to want an election to get rid of him. But Zelensky, of course, is in a very desperate situation. He can't surrender, even though at some level he must know how badly it's going. I mean, I don't know how much coke you have to do to become completely divorced from reality, but given his latest performances, including a bizarre interview, I think it was with ABC News, where he looked like guys I used to see at parties like 15 years ago, when I was still a student. Like he's sat there looking manic. And he was asked about the hideous bourgeois media drone. Well, how do you sleep at night? And he says, "I have so much power. I have so much power." It's like, yeah, I've had that conversation with a cokehead. It's fairly familiar, but this guy is apparently in charge of a war effort. No, how in charge he really is another question. So it's all starting to fall to pieces. They've been killing each other for a while. There was a case of a government minister who was traveling by helicopter who was shot down. I think this was about 6 months ago. It was back in the early part of the year, probably longer, about 8-9 months ago. And there was a shooting down of that helicopter. They claimed the Russians did it, but again, there was never any evidence provided that the Russians did it. There's dozens of different factions inside the power system in Kiev, all of whom are now fighting like rats in a sack because the end's coming for them. And they don't even have the discipline of the original Nazis who stuck with the failed Austrian watercolor artist to the bitter end, despite the various attempts to assassinate him. So this is what happens when a corrupt regime faces the end. And I should also make the point that the thing about Zelensky is that and along with the entirety of the bulk of the Ukraine war and the way it's been portrayed, is Zelensky is entirely a confection. He's a creation of various different PR agencies, starting off, of course, with his own PR, thanks to the show that he was on. And then moving on to, of course, being handled by apparently British public relations specialists. They're the ones who came up with the green shirt. If you remember in the early days of the special military operation, he was actually wearing a suit and speaking in Russian to the Russian population, attempting to appeal to them. It didn't work. And then he adopted the unshaven jumper look that made him look as if he'd just sort of come out of a trench, even though he's in a bunker apparently in western Ukraine most of the time. He's not in Bankover, I think it's called, the presidential residence there. So it's it's an image that was crafted for him by the British and the US imperialists, and it's not real. Nothing about him is real. Like, he's not making the decisions. They're pretending that he is. They're pretending that Zelensky is in charge, just the same way that they're pretending that they have no influence over Netanyahu. It's all a pretense. Like, they could, as Putin has said himself on many occasions, the US could end the war tomorrow. They just don't want to. It would be more damage. They judge that it would be more damaging to their interests if they pulled the plug on the Ukrainian regime. And so the Ukrainian regime must carry on fighting in the belief that the 571,000 range of sanctions will bite in at some point. Now, the other point to bear in mind here is that they, as I said on the previous evening's stream, they could also stop the war in Palestine. They could just pick up the phone to Netanyahu and say, no more weapons, no more shells, no more Iron Dome missiles, no more air defense. You go to war with the wider region, you're completely on your own. We're cutting you off. The White House has the power to do that. They, of course, won't, because that would be very damaging to their interests as they see them now at this moment in the Middle East. So the idea that Zelensky is the man in charge is a pretense. It's a fraud, as even Gerhard Schroeder observed recently in that interview that he gave in the German press, which, by the way, has attracted precisely zero attention here, and I don't suppose anybody can be really surprised about that. I don't think it made the headlines anywhere else in the NATO world either. Barely even registered in Germany itself. But we know that Zelensky was overruled by Biden, or somebody in the White House, and Johnson went over there and acted as the messenger boy. And Zelensky was essentially told, you can't agree to this. And of course, Zelensky is also trapped between the NATO gang and the Nazis and various other ultra-right-wing elements who would happily kill him if he strayed too far from what they regard as the path. And the ultra-rightist elements in Ukraine are the most loyal servants of US imperialism, just the same as the jihadists are in Syria, and just the same as the ultra-Zionists are in occupied Palestine, or at least they were until this point. There may be a dispute brewing between them and the US imperialists at some point soon, when the US imperialists have resolved this particular situation. So Zelensky on the way out, his supporters getting desperate, start assassinating people. What can we expect now? Well, if the White House can't get the mega funding bill through Congress, and if they have to choose, the support in Congress is probably going to be weighted in favor of Israel, though that's now creating problems for the Democrats, considering that now the Israel situation has blown up inside even like the soft left in the United States has got to a certain degree animated by this and are going out and openly opposing Biden. So this is now creating more fissures inside the Democratic Party. The Republican Party is divided over Ukraine. The Democratic Party is divided at the base level, not quite at the congressional level. It seems that like the likes of Tlaib and others will make noise but not do very much. But at the base level, at the activist layer, it's starting to become a bit of a problem for them. Together with, of course, there being so many Arab and Muslim votes that could refuse to come out next year, and that now is a real problem for the Democrats. So this is becoming more and more of an issue. But what will likely be the case? I will still argue that the imperialists will not want to give up on the Ukraine plan. They certainly won't want at this stage to be left with a catastrophic and very public defeat in Ukraine. Now, Putin has made various things clear in his public statements around the potential for negotiation is that basically Ukraine gets no land back. In fact, Ukraine might, if it is even allowed to continue to be in existence, end up losing the coast down to Odessa and, of course, Kharkov. and that the Russians might take a bit more as well. So they're still prepared to have a Ukrainian state in existence, but it will be a very much smaller and truncated one. And of course, there'll be no question of it joining NATO. And there'll be no question of it joining the EU either under the current terms, because EU membership and NATO membership are running hand in hand at the moment. Now, of course, there may be a deal available to there may have been a deal available at some point to separate the two out, but there isn't any more. So the US imperialists will not want to give this up, though. They won't want to, in the middle of this increasingly troublesome war that they've now created in the Middle East, they won't want to see the Russian army rolling all the way down to Odessa and all the way to Kiev, and that being on all the news channels. So what are they going to try and do? Well, there's not much that they can do in Ukraine more than they're doing now. Morale in the Ukrainian army, according to, again, Russian sources mainly, but also like videos that have leaked out from the Ukrainian side, the Ukrainian morale is at rock bottom. The average age of the Ukrainian soldier is like 41 years old, which means there's a lot of older men in there, like guys in their later 40s, 50s, 60s, even some cases of guys in their 70s. This isn't an army that can stand much more. There's now videos coming out of Ukrainians and foreign fighters turning on each other and killing each other. I mean, this looks like the end. The end could come basically when the Russians will it to be so. They've already apparently got, as we've mentioned before, this air defense system which can very rapidly shoot down just about any plane the Ukrainians have got. So what little air cover they have is gone. The F-16s are going to be far too little, far too late. The first Abrams tank has apparently turned up, but it's a less advanced version than what the Americans have. And the Russians have worked out how to burn through every single other thing NATO has given the Ukrainians. So the Abrams tank will be no different. So they've got nothing left other than like a large amount of now significantly older men who've been mobilized and are now trying to mobilize teenagers and women. So it all depends now just how rapidly do the Russians want to bring this to a close, and how far do they want to go? How far can they go? If they've got 300,000 men, they haven't moved into the combat zone yet. That's one thing. Do they go for some kind of knockout blow, or do they continue to move in a slow fashion? I think, personally, judging from everything we've seen so far, that there is absolutely no reason from the Russian political point of view for the Russian leadership to suddenly decide that they're going to go hell for leather to Kiev or something. They may slowly increase the amount of their advances, but they're going to go about it in the same very slow, very careful way that they have been over the last 18 months. And the question then is, do the Ukrainians surrender? This depends if Zelensky survives the night or survives the next week or so. Are you going to see more mass surrenders from Ukrainian units? You're already getting an awful lot of surrenders. The Russians openly broadcast. They've got there's a whole radio channel apparently that the Ukrainians who wish to surrender can contact to broadcast the fact that we're here, we're this unit located on this part of the front line, we wish to surrender, can we come across? And now you've got as many as 15 or so thousand former Ukrainian forces who have now remobilized under Russian colors and are fighting against the Ukrainian regime. So the end will come when the Russian leadership decides it will, and quite how that happens is still up in the air, though I suspect that they won't change their game plan too much on this. So, slight diversion there, but a necessary one. But I wanted to move on to look at some writing from Lenin from all the way back in 1906. But before I do that, I will say hello to Ash from all the way down there in Melbourne, who says that the US ruling class is unified on Israel, split on Ukraine. The UK is the reverse. Now we hear reports of the EU and US trying to get a peace deal in Ukraine. What is happening? Well, what's happening is that the various different bits of the US imperialist bloc are now running around like headless chickens trying to work out what to focus on. But they've all got problems because the US ruling class is relatively unified on Israel. But they've also got a problem in that there's a growing trend in the US, not just in Arab or Muslim areas, but reflected in wider polling where the favorability ratings for Israel are not good. That's why the Israelis are getting worried, and they're dispatching like that odious homunculus Naftali Bennett out to Washington to sort of drum up more support. For the Europeans, it's far worse because the longer this goes on, the more chance the very large demonstrations that are occurring in all the way across the NATO countries, that these become more anti-NATO demonstrations, which we communists devoutly hope that they will and will work to make them so. So they're in a jam, basically. The British ruling class are freaking out because they've stumbled into a situation where they've triggered the most widespread anti-war movement in 20 years. And they've triggered it at a time when they themselves, that is the political leadership of the British bourgeoisie, Sunak, Starmer and the others, are all despised. Now you might say, well, Blair was despised 20 years ago. That's true, he was. But he became despised only really after the war. He carried into the war quite a significant amount of political approval within the Labour aristocracy and petty bourgeoisie. That's not true with Starmer. It's not true with Sunak either. There's no real faith in Sunak, even amongst elements of the ruling class. So they've stumbled into a gigantic political problem now that's becoming worse and worse. So they are stuck. Some of them in the US, some of the more rabidly pro-Israel gang, may want to trigger, basically bring the Ukraine thing to an end, so that they can focus everything on nailing down, as they would see it, their position in the Middle East. And that will have a certain degree of support, particularly within Congress, and it will be a school of thought in the White House as well. The other faction will want to keep going in Ukraine, knowing that any defeat there is only going to make their position in the Middle East even worse, because they're going to have been publicly humiliated and defeated. Yes, US forces weren't openly engaged in Ukraine, but I'll bet that when the research is done, you'll find a good few hundred at least recently discharged US servicemen will have died there. I'm willing to bet that the number will easily be in three figures, maybe higher, I don't know. But I think certainly hundreds of US personnel have died there. Many more may have been wounded. It's all being hidden at the moment, and the numbers aren't huge, but they are significant. It's more than a couple of dozen. But either way, they're going to suffer a severe blow to their prestige, more so than has been the case already. So what's going on is that they're desperately trying to find a way forward for themselves, and they're trying to find a way out of the political hole they've dug. They got away with the Ukraine war for a long time, because it didn't appear, and it was covered up, just how extensive the US imperialist involvement in Ukraine was. It was presented as, big bad Russia attacks plucky Ukraine. And that was a narrative they sold. It was never a narrative that became popular, though. There were some pro-NATO demonstrations in the beginning of, towards the middle of last year. But these were a few thousand at best. You look at these pro-Palestine demonstrations, you're looking at 500-odd thousand in London, 300,000 in Washington, D.C., hundreds of thousands in Paris and Berlin, even demonstrations in places like Sardinia. That's a significant problem if you're the ruling class. So you need to find a way out. They can't find a way out because whichever way they turn, they're going to end up looking more diminished, more weak, and they're going to become even more hated than they are now. So everything is disordered, to paraphrase Mao. And this is what happens when the ruling class enters into a crisis and can't find a good way out for itself. They look confused and divided. Good evening to Burke. Good evening to Rob and Beans. How you doing, comrades? Zuleika, good evening to you. Movie Maker Joe, good evening to you. DE, is Zelensky going to do a Ghani? Well, Zelensky's preference, and this will be his preference, is to take the money and run, I would imagine. If he can get out, he'll try and get out. Whether the US imperialists and their British allies will allow him to is another question. If it's the case that he's going to get offed imminently, then they may try and extract him. The US will probably try via delivery of large amounts of banknotes to get maybe Zelensky on side and, put him into the presidency, or hash up some new coalition government to make it look as if everything's going just fine. But either way, this is bad, and everything is clearly on the slide. Hello to Munis. Makumi says, demilitarization is a slow and systematic affair not to be rushed, like the mistakes the US made in Iraq. Yeah, that's why I agree, and I don't think the Russians are going to speed up their campaign or intensify it too much. I think they're going to keep on rolling. It also suits their purposes as well, because the more they keep the US bogged down in terms of political and economic support for the Maidan regime, the worse it gets for the US. It's now, the US thought it was springing a trap on the Russians by, as they thought, luring them into a war in Ukraine, then hitting them with the sanctions package, and then hopefully collapsing the economy. It's all turned into its opposite. The Russians adapted and planned adequately after 2014, built up enough new systems of trade and economic engagement and economic management that enabled them to survive the sanctions, but not just to survive, but to start really building the economic base, particularly the industrial base of the country, back up again, based on a number of things, including, as we've discussed many times before, the move towards more state-directed banking being one avenue of this, the usage of oil and gas revenue to help develop other parts of the economy, and now the war, rather than draining the Russian economy of resources, is accelerating Russian economic growth. Not just war production, but also the reorientation of the economy, the regrowth of the manufacturing sector, the reshoring of and the recreation of an industrial base that was lost in the 1990s through the decimation of the Yeltsin era. All of this is undoing the work of the U.S. comprador, the Russian compradors who are in the service of U.S. imperialism. And it's all being done through the crucible of this war in Ukraine. So everything that the U.S. imperialists planned for this Ukraine war has turned into the exact opposite. It is now NATO that has been revealed as completely weak. It's the NATO bloc's economies that are increasingly looking fragile and looking like they're going to collapse. The U.S. has a gigantic unexploded bomb in the form of the problems in the derivatives market and the gigantic debt problem that still hangs over the entire U.S. economy. Everything has become its opposite now. And all this desperate cope you're getting about, China imminent collapse, China imminent collapse, China imminent collapse. There's a meme going around that just chronicles all the times that The Economist, which is this idiotic rag that's a favorite of certain elements of the ruling class here, has said that China's going to collapse. It's said that almost every year since 1989, and it's always been wrong. So everything has turned into its opposite. The Ukraine war has become a major means by which the Russian state has strengthened itself immeasurably. The economy has strengthened enormously thanks to the measures that the Russian state has taken and their extensive building up of trade links, not just with China, but with Iran, the development even further of the extensive economic linkage with Central Asia, which is also damaging the position of British imperialism in Central Asia. So, yes, everything turns into its opposite. As Ash comments, the ability for something to become its opposite, win for the dialectic. As Mao once said, turn bad things into good things. And this is exactly what has happened. So, I'll move now to the discussion of this passage from Lenin, which I wanted to use to demonstrate certain aspects of the failure of Western Marxism, yet again, to adequately analyze what is going on, both in Ukraine and in Palestine. And this is taken from the works of Lenin that are available on the Marxist Internet Archive. It's a 1906 work on guerrilla warfare. I'm going to drop it into all of the various chats on Rumble and on Odyssey, so you can all look at it. And it's just the first section here, which I think is worth reading. And Lenin's discussing guerrilla warfare in this, because to give the historical context, in 1906, you have the long-running after effects, or not after effects, a more accurate way of describing it, you have the long-running process that is the 1905 to 1907 revolution. And this, of course, begins with the march of the Petrograd proletariat, led by the police double agent, Father Gapon, on the Winter Palace, and the armed forces of the Tsar opened fire on this peaceful, unarmed demonstration, causing essentially the beginning of a riot and an uprising that swept across the country and destabilized Tsarism between 1905 and to 1907. And it was 2 years in which the Tsarist state essentially lost control of the country, or large areas of the country, but it petered out because the revolutionary forces were too weak. But you did have the emergence for the first time of Soviets or workers' councils across the Russian Empire, most famously being the Petrograd Soviet. So in this period, the question of how to wage the struggle against the Tsarist state was under active discussion amongst the Bolsheviks and the other Marxist groups. The Mensheviks, of course, wanted to continue their marriage to the Cadet Party and the bourgeois liberals, believing, of course, that only a long period of capitalism could enable Russia to be ready for socialism. And therefore, the alliance with the bourgeois liberals must be secured and pursued at all times by the Marxists. And of course, as Lenin was fond of repeating, the Mensheviks had become trapped in the same way our modern-day Western Marxists are, in basically a tired and rote repetition of a formula for revolution that they credited to Marx and Engels. In reality, it had much more to do with the Second International and people like Karl Kautsky, I would argue anyway. But they said they took this from Marx, that socialism could only hope to triumph in an advanced country with a large proletariat, and it couldn't happen in a country that was dominated by what these pseudo-Marxists would call an ignorant and backward peasantry. And of course, this is something that Lenin disputed. It was one of the core reasons behind the original Bolshevik-Menshevik split. And Lenin, as he did many times, would address the Mensheviks, and he's the Menshevik critics, and accuse them with very much increasing justifications of basically just turning Marxism into a dry series of formulas that was completely disconnected from the real world, the revolutionary developments inside the Russian proletariat, to accuse them of ignoring the revolutionary potential of the landless peasants, and to basically that they'd taken Marxism from being a science just to being something that is a series of phrases that they repeat endlessly, and they showed no ability to adapt to Russian conditions. And so when he's talking about guerrilla warfare, he opens it up by saying this, and I'm going to read this first passage under chapter 1 here. Quote reads as follows: "What are the fundamental demands which every Marxist should make of an examination of the question of forms of struggle. In the first place, Marxism differs from all primitive forms of socialism by not binding the movement to any one particular form of struggle. It recognizes the most varied forms of struggle. It does not concoct them, but only generalizes organizers, gives conscious expression to those forms of struggle of the revolutionary classes which arise of themselves in the course of the movement, absolutely hostile to all abstract formulas and to all doctrinaire recipes. Marxism demands an attentive attitude to the mass struggle in progress, which as the movement develops, as the class consciousness of the masses grows, as economic and political crises become acute, continually gives rise to new and more varied methods of defense and attack. Marxism, therefore, positively does not reject any form of struggle. Under no circumstances does Marxism confine itself to the forms of struggle possible and in existence at the given moment only, recognizing, as it does, that new forms of struggle, unknown to the participants of the given period, inevitably arise as the given situation changes. In this respect, Marxism learns, if we may so express it, from mass practice, and makes no claim whatever to teach the masses forms of struggle invented by systematizers in the seclusion of their studies. So, and he, by the way, he ends this passage with a favourable reference, I think, to Kautsky, and he says, We know, said Kautsky, for instance, when examining the forms of social revolution, that the coming crisis will introduce new forms of struggle that we are now unable to foresee. Unfortunately, of course, Kautsky proved that he was an opportunist in the end and actually betrayed all of the earlier revolutionary writings that he'd done. Now, I'm going to continue to read from this particular excerpt from Lenin because I think the second paragraph bears examination as well. So this quote continues as follows. In the second place, Marxism demands an absolutely historical examination of the question of the forms of struggle. To treat this question apart from the concrete historical situation betrays a failure to understand the rudiments of dialectical materialism. At different stages of economic evolution, depending upon differences in political, national, cultural, living and other conditions, different forms of struggle come to the fore and become the principal forms of struggle, and in connection with this the secondary, auxiliary forms of struggle undergo change in their turn. To attempt to answer yes or no to the question whether any particular means of struggle should be used without making a detailed examination of the concrete situation of the given movement at the given stage of its development means completely to abandon the Marxist position. So, this is the view of Lenin when it comes to the question of tactics in the struggle. And now what he's saying there, in effect, is that he's talking about the way in which Marxists, as scientific socialists, must analyze the different phases of the struggle. They must make an interrogation of every different form of organization, of different forms of communicating with the masses, of the slogans that are used, of the way in which the struggle is conducted, and that this must be tested in practice, like a scientific experiment almost. It must be tested in practice whether you can adequately further the cause of the proletariat by, shall we say, standing in bourgeois elections, which the Bolsheviks were to do after the Tsar's reforms in 1907. They were to run in those elections and to win a few seats. But do you then remain bound to that method of political struggle? And of course Lenin's answer is no. You reassess as the struggle evolves. And this, of course, reached a certain conflict when in the Zimmerwald left, the anti-war European left, in the middle of World War I, when the Easter Rising exploded in Dublin in 1916, and many Marxists in the anti-war left at the time attacked it as being a petty bourgeois adventure, as being the act of Celtic romanticists. But Lenin, of course, and I've posted about this before, in his dispute with Rosa Luxemburg over the national question, said that no, we welcome the rising in Dublin, even if it failed, even if the majority of the political forces within it weren't in exact agreement with us. It's crucial to support it because not only does it favour the state of the national liberation struggle in Ireland, but also it's a blow struck right at the heart of British imperialism. At the time still the most powerful imperialist power on earth. And so to not support the Easter Rising would be akin to abandoning revolution, because the revolution in Ireland goes through and it starts with the resolving of the Irish national question, which is what Lenin analysed the situation as being in 1916 in his debate with Luxemburg. Luxemburg, who argued, and I will do a more thorough exploration of the views of Luxemburg on the national question at some point, but she was very hostile to the idea of the national question of the small nations, as Marxists sometimes put it, waging a national struggle, because she saw this as pointless. This was, I would argue, partially influenced by her hostile views towards like the Polish, what she thought were, with some justification, the very parochial and reactionary Polish nationalists, because she was born and brought up in Poland. And so she knew these people quite well. And so she got into a dispute with Lenin about this, and he used the example of the Easter Rising to argue that this is the way the Irish Revolution is going to go. It has to deal with the national question first, because without dealing with the national question, you can't then advance towards the question of socialism. You can't have socialism when Ireland is essentially a colony in the British Empire. And again, Lenin would go back to this. He would argue with all and sundry and say, look, no, you need to, far from Lenin being a guy who just repeated ad nauseum a formula. He said, no, you have to have a revolution that's just like the Russian experience, otherwise it's not a revolution. Lenin would never argued that. He always said the specific national conditions, the specific balance of forces within a nation, the history of the oppressed classes there, all of this has to be taken into consideration when actually evaluating what course the revolution is to proceed down. So, moving this right up to date and looking at the critiques offered by people like Douglas Lane or Chris Cutrone, two academic Marxists, or the Trotskyites in Britain, who argue to varying different degrees, some very similar ways, in very similar ways, argue that there's no solution to the Palestinian question without a workers' revolution. And some go as far as to say, and many Trotskyites say this, they'll say that they support Palestinian resistance, but they do not support the resolution of the Palestinian national question, because many of them, including, the last time I read their critique, the International Marxist Tendency, they and the CWI, my former organization, they both argued in their material both now and 9 years ago when the last big Israeli incursion into Gaza went on. They both argued that the Palestinian working class should unite with the Israeli working class to jointly overthrow the capitalist classes in Israel-Palestine. Now, of course, this is a completely pig-ignorant analysis. In fact, to call it an analysis is an abuse of language, because what you have is, when facing the Palestinian masses, is a question of, well, what is the primary contradiction on the one hand? And on the other hand, you have the question of, well, when you have a settler colonial state, which is what Israel is it going to be the case that any of the working class there, who, by the way, do gain advantages from being in a settler colonial state, advantages over the Palestinian masses, and advantages based on the continued oppression of the Palestinian masses, how many of them are going to go in for solidarity with the Palestinians? A few, not many. How many in the millions of workers that were in French Algeria stood in solidarity with the Algerian liberation struggle? The answer, Not that many, because their comparative advantages were based on the suppression of the Algerian people and nation. And when it came to independence, most of these white workers from Europe fucked off back to Europe again. So when you have settler colonial states such as Algeria back in the day, or Israel now, I keep making the comparison with Algeria, by the way, because I think it's the one that makes the most sense in terms of understanding both the nature of a large-scale settler colonial enterprise and also the relationship that Algeria had with France is in some ways comparable to the one that Israel has with the US ruling class. So to say, as these Trotskyites and these academic Marxists do, that the Palestinian masses should abandon any form of armed struggle in order to unite with the Israeli working class, who are in union organizations and political parties that are ferociously reactionary, who jealously guard their privileges that they do get from being colonists in an occupied land, and who will guard them against any infringement. To say that that is the basis upon which you are prepared to support any struggle means that you basically support no struggle for the Palestinian national question at all. And we're back with Lenin's dispute with Luxembourg, basically. We're back with Lenin's view of the national question here versus Luxembourg's view of it. And it's a view that, of course, Trotsky, in his writings on the Balkan Wars, he also showed himself to be ferociously hostile towards the rights of small nations to self-determination. He later pretended that he was in favor of the self-determination of nations when he called for the exit of Ukraine from the USSR in the late 1930s to suit the purposes of his allies in the Ukrainian fascist movement. And they were allies, as I've outlined before. So, what would Lenin's approach here be? And let's inform it by referring to how Mao further developed this. Mao, when he's writing in the work that we did previously on a in-depth study on the correct handling of contradictions amongst the people, Mao goes through in order the phases of struggle dealing with the primary contradiction that were faced by the Communist Party of China. He makes the argument about the need to reassess at each period. So in the initial period, they're in a struggle against the warlords in China. And that necessitated an alliance with Sun Yat-sen's Kuomintang movement. Then, of course, Sun Yat-sen dies relatively early, and he's replaced by Chiang Kai-shek. And Chiang Kai-shek, of course, then turns on the communists and kills a load of them, and the Chinese, the Communist Party of China has to go essentially underground and fight a long and very bitter peasant war against Chiang Kai-shek and the warlords. But then, of course, Mao says correctly that, well, when the Japanese take Manchuria and start their invasion of China, then we had to reassess. The primary contradiction then was not the communists versus the Kuomintang, or even against the warlords. It was against the Japanese imperialists and their collaborators. And that's why, of course, even with all the butchery that Chiang Kai-shek had engaged in against the communists, the Communist Party of China pursued a popular front, a united front, rather, with Chiang Kai-shek, who was eventually forced into it by being held at gunpoint by some of his own generals, because he kept fighting the communists and avoiding fighting the Japanese. So the fact that the main threat in China was Japanese imperialism then meant that the main problem was, of course, facing the Chinese was reasserting national independence and sovereignty. And that, to that end, it necessitated an alliance with Chiang Kai-shek, who most of the communist leaders would have cheerfully have shot. But of course, you don't get to make those choices when you're in that kind of a difficult situation. And the major force that has the bulk of the arms and funding and the ability, if it wanted to fight the Japanese is, of course, the Kuomintang. So you make an alliance with them, whilst at the same time, of course, making appeals to their membership showing that you're the most dedicated fighters for national liberation. At the end of the Japanese war, of course, the primary contradiction becomes again the need to fight against Chiang Kai-shek and what Mao refers to as the bureaucrat capitalists. And that then becomes the primary contradiction. The struggle then moves back to the struggle against Chiang Kai-shek once the Japanese imperialists have been expelled from the country. And that struggle then resolves itself with the victory of 1949. Then you, of course, have the initial period of the new democracy and the building of the People's Democratic Dictatorship. And, of course, you have, as Mao says, the need to identify the enemy at this stage. At each stage of the unfolding of the struggle of the revolution and the building of the new state, at each stage a new primary contradiction emerges, a new enemy is there to be struggled against. And we take that insight and we combine it with Lenin's interrogation of the question back in 1906 and again back in left-wing communism and infantile disorder from 1921. You can see that Mao is directly informed by all of Lenin's writing on this question, and Stalin elaborates on it too. And so to refer it to the Palestinian question, the question of, well, what is the primary contradiction now? The primary contradiction for the Palestinians is the national liberation question. It is the national question. The Palestinians are a people, a nation who have been denied the ability to actually assert their sovereignty and national independence. They've been denied it for over 100 years, first under British occupation, now under the colonial regime of the Zionist state. And you can't skip over that question. Trotskyites and academic Marxists think that you can. But the central problem facing Palestinians in Gaza was, of course, the fact that they were in this open-air prison, and only one form of struggle was actually open to them. They tried the peaceful forms of struggle. The Israelis shot them all anyway. The violent form of struggle, the armed uprising, the taking the fight out of the concentration camp that they are in directly to the Israeli military and militarized police forces, that was the way in which they chose to hit the Israeli power, and through that hit the US imperialists. So until the primary contradiction for the Palestinians which is resolved, which is the national question. And in that struggle, of course, the Marxist-Leninist forces of the PFLP, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine have had to make a unified national liberation front, shall we say, with Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas and other groups of a more Islamic persuasion. And this is, of course, an absolute necessity, because the common point of agreement between all of them, and you can see this on the archive online about the way in which they drew up their points of unity to forge a unified group or a unified force, was the need to struggle against the occupation, to struggle against the occupation in the West Bank and in Gaza. And that is the primary contradiction facing the Palestinian masses right now. They can't unify with a colonial occupying force. They can't unify with a colonial power whose working class gains privileges directly from the national oppression of the Palestinians. Until they resolve the national question, then the class question is on the back burner, to say the least. Until they move through that phase, then they are going to have to deal with the national question first. Now, the objection will come up from these trots and academic Marxists and ultra-leftists. But there's a Palestinian capitalist class, and which is true. There is a Palestinian capitalist class on the West Bank, and it does business with Israel. That's true. The collaborationist regime of Abbas is partially based on the Palestinian capitalist class, and some of them certainly do collaborate with Israel and beyond them with US imperialism. Now, the same, though, could be said for certain aspects of the Chinese capitalists and landlords. There were Chinese capitalists and landlords who collaborated with the Japanese. Does that mean that the national question, as faced by the Chinese Revolution, shouldn't have been solved? That it was wrong to unify with the Kuomintang to fight Japanese imperialism because there were some Chinese landlords and Chinese capitalists who collaborated with the Japanese? Would anybody seriously make that point? Actually, I do believe that some Trotskyites and academic Marxists would, because all of these people are against the Chinese Revolution anyway. Just because there are collaborators within the comprador bourgeois of Palestine does not render the Palestinian national liberation struggle somehow irrelevant or somehow unworthy of support or not the primary contradiction. It plainly is. Look how imperialism is responding to the actions of the Palestinian armed forces. They're responding by panicking and rushing every resource they can into the area in an attempt to intimidate everybody against coming to the aid of the Palestinian National Liberation Forces in any way. So you examine what Lenin actually said about revolutionary strategy and tactics, what Stalin said and what Mao said, you will find that all of them valued the consistent testing out of different tactics, that the main issue, the main point that needs to be emphasized was, well, how does the revolutionary struggle proceed? How do more of the oppressed masses get drawn into the struggle? What is, to use Mao's phrase, the primary contradiction at this phase in the struggle? That's the question. Constantly testing out how the communists approach this, constantly testing out methods of organization, ways of dealing with the masses, slogans to be raised, tactics to be pursued. That is scientific socialism in practice, not the dry and arid repetition of certain formulas, which is designed to take Lenin from being the greatest revolutionary strategist of the 20th century, arguable that Stalin and Mao were equal to him in some ways, but certainly this man is the originator. You take him from being this man who valued flexibility and adaptability and constantly testing yourself and your methods in the struggle, and you turn him into essentially a lifeless icon and a series of slogans, then you have done a profound disservice to the legacy of Lenin, and you have yourself ignored the real legacy, the real revolutionary legacy of Lenin. And it's not for nothing that, of course, all of these trots and academic Marxists sneer at and reject the works of Stalin and Mao. Some of them pretend to be in favor of the Cuban Revolution, but they're not really in favor of it. If you dive deeper into their theories, they will, of course, ignore the revolutionary legacy of the DPRK, represented by, of course, Kim Il-sung and others. And they will just keep repeating their idea that, oh, well, it has to be like October. It has to be like October, despite the fact that they don't even understand what made the October Revolution possible in the first place. So read Lenin on guerrilla warfare and, of course, left-wing communism and infantile disorder. Read Stalin's criticisms of the opposition, where he covers a lot of these points. You can find it in this very excellent book here. And read Mao's work on the correct handling of contradictions among the people, especially. And you will see what the revolutionaries of the past centuries did and how they assessed this question. You will find that the approach used by the Palestinian communist organizations in unifying with all the different resistance groups, including Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, is the correct approach to handling their primary contradiction facing the Palestinian masses right now, which is, of course, the national question, which remains the most urgent question facing them at this moment. Right, I am going to leave it there for this evening. I'll be back again tomorrow. So thank you to everybody who has tuned in. Thank you to all those who've contributed to the chat. Just one more thing before we go. We've got a few comments to catch up on, actually. So Muzzle Paint says, November the 11th, Saturday, we are marching on Biden's home in Wilmington, Delaware at 11 a.m. Meeting at 909 Center Road, Wilmington, Delaware, 19807. Is that the zip code? I'm presuming that it is. Pirate and Flipper said the Israeli state was also weakened because of the internal contradictions that became more open in the last month. So there was a good opportunity. Very true. Dingo ate me baby. Hi back to you, sir. And Philbin says, excellent speech at the Revolution Reports conference. Also great foresight in crediting DFLP, PFLP as part of the Palestinian counterattack. We can't let attempt to divide Palestinian resistance succeed. All right, apparently the cover of the book was not clear, so I'm going to hold it up again for 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It's called On the Opposition. It's a collection of writings by the great man himself, Stalin. You can find most of it on the Marxist Internet Archive. Right, until tomorrow, I will bid all of you adieu and say solidarity and victory to the Palestinian liberation struggle.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died.